economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
Imagine that one morning Washington wakes up to a new world. A world where the familiar order is shattered not by war or disaster, but by a decision made thousands of kilometers to the north. A world where Canada, a country that for decades had been considered a quiet and obedient neighbor, suddenly becomes the most dangerous player on the continent. It all started with a few words spoken with cold calm and almost no emotion. But those words hit the political establishment like an earthquake. Canada was no longer going to play by American rules.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
At first glance, it looked like diplomatic rhetoric, another protocol, another press conference. But within weeks, alarm bells were ringing in Washington's think tanks. Hundreds of pages of internal reports, graphs, forecasts, and secret assessments all pointed to one thing: the US was fatally dependent on what it had previously considered guaranteed. Electricity, oil, uranium, gas. The foundation of the American economy was controlled by those they used to call friends. While the White House was discussing the next round of tariffs, something much more serious was happening in Canada. Small towns that most Americans had never heard of began making decisions that would change the fate of the continent. One of them, on the quiet coast of British Columbia, refused to renew its license to export electricity to the United States. For local residents, this was a step toward energy independence. For Ottawa, it was the first shot in a new type of economic war.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Washington did not believe it for a long time. After all, Canada had always been a source of stability, a reliable supplier, a NATO ally, and a partner in trade agreements. But behind the outward calm, a new strategy was taking shape, a well-thought-out, carefully calibrated strategy designed to last for years to come. Its goal was simple: to stop being a raw materials appendage and turn its own resources into a tool of influence. When energy shortages began in the US and the construction of new power lines stalled due to tariffs, Canada took action. It signed deals with Indonesia, strengthened ties with Mexico, and opened doors to Europe. Against the backdrop of American crises, Ottawa quietly built a new economy, an economy of the future, where critical minerals, green energy, and technology become weapons more powerful than any army. And when the White House finally realized what was happening, it was too late. Canada had already become an alternative to China in the supply of strategic materials. Its agreements with European countries had turned into a new energy bridge across the Atlantic. And for the first time in decades, the US felt that control was slipping from its hands.
They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Today, no one talks about this openly. Not politicians, not generals, not economists. But behind closed doors in Washington, the same question is being asked more and more often. What if Canada is no longer an ally, but a power capable of dictating terms? What if the quiet country in the north has just turned its resources into a weapon and America into its target? The silence in London was so thick you could cut it with a knife. In the crowded hall, journalists held their breath as a man known for his restraint and cold calculation approached the microphone. He spoke calmly, without unnecessary emotion, but every word sounded like a challenge to the old world order. Canada, he said, no longer intended to play the role of junior partner. At first glance, this phrase seemed like a standard diplomatic formula, another gesture of independence, which even the most reliable allies sometimes flaunt. But this time, everything was different. The moment the cameras clicked for the last time, a rift formed between Ottawa and Washington, which soon turned into a chasm.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
In the first hours after the speech, the reaction of American officials was restrained. The White House decided that this was a matter of domestic politics, an attempt to strengthen positions amid falling ratings and public discontent. However, the very next day, analytical reports from the CIA and the State Department began to arrive, marked urgent. They contained the first hints that Canada had been preparing for this moment for many years. Back in 2018, when the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel and a 50% tariff on aluminum, Canadian economists warned that such measures would hurt not only China and Europe, but America itself. But no one in Washington listened. The talk was of the America First policy, and Canada, as was believed at the time, would not dare to object. Just a few years have passed, and the consequences have become apparent. Prices for transformers, cable, and construction metal have tripled. More than 200 energy projects have been suspended or cancelled due to a shortage of materials. American infrastructure, already worn out, was on the verge of collapse. A classified memorandum from the US Department of Energy, leaked to the press, stated that by the end of the decade, the country could face 800 hours of power outages annually. That's more than a month in the dark, not for poor third world countries, but for a superpower accustomed to considering itself the center of civilization.
So the energy sector is a very important sector of the Canadian economy. It's actually only second to the housing sector in terms of its contribution to the GDP. It's over 10% of Canada's economy.
But the real irony was that Canada had always been the foundation of American energy security. Up to 80% of imported electricity, a quarter of uranium, millions of barrels of oil every day, all of this came from the north. And then there was hydroelectric power, natural gas, copper and nickel resources, without which no service center or electric car factory could operate. The US has come to regard these supplies as something of a natural right, an eternal agreement sealed not only by treaties but also by geography. However, everything changed when a small town on the coast of British Columbia said one short word: no. Powell River, a place almost no one in Washington had heard of, refused to renew its license to export cheap electricity to the US. Officially, this was in the interests of local residents, for the sake of environmental sustainability and the future of children. But there was more to it than that. The decision was supported by provincial authorities, trade unions, and then the federal cabinet itself. Ottawa understood that it was not just energy that was at stake, but national dignity. And this decision became the first act of a new strategy that Western experts would later call a resource revolution.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
At first, Washington treated this as an unfortunate incident. One city refused to sell electricity. It happens. But within a few months, similar initiatives began to appear in Alberta, Manitoba, and Quebec. Local parliaments discussed the possibility of reducing exports, citing the need to conserve energy for the domestic market. The American media tried to explain what was happening as political theater, but behind the scenes at the US Department of Commerce, panic reigned. One report dated April stated that a reduction in Canadian oil supplies by at least 10% would lead to gasoline prices in border states rising to $7 per gallon. At the same time, a quiet industrial boom was beginning in Canadian laboratories and mining companies. The country, once considered a raw materials appendage, was rapidly transforming into a technological powerhouse. Projects to extract rare earth metals cobalt, nickel, and lithium were launched in the northern provinces. These elements became key to the production of batteries, artificial intelligence systems, and defense technologies. The US continued to play the old game of tariffs and sanctions, while Canada prepared for the future.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Some US senators demanded an immediate review of trade agreements, but it was too late. Ottawa signed new contracts with Europe, Indonesia, and Mexico, gradually removing its exports from American dependence. Realizing the scale of the threat, the Pentagon urgently began investing in Canadian mining projects in an attempt to retain at least some control. But even these steps seemed belated. Internal White House correspondence, later made public by journalists, included the line, "We can no longer consider Canada predictable." This admission marked the beginning of the end of the old model of North American partnership. After all, everything that happened next was merely a consequence of years of complacency.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
In 2023, according to a Toronto-based think tank, Canada surpassed the US for the first time in terms of per capita investment in clean energy. Dozens of rare metal processing plants opened in the country, and technology exports to Europe grew by 40%. Against this backdrop of prosperity, American companies faced equipment shortages, rising prices, and dependence on imports. The situation was exacerbated by internal crises, outdated power grids, a shortage of qualified engineers, and rising tariffs. Canada, on the other hand, demonstrated a rare combination of political stability and economic pragmatism. In just a few years, the country had transformed itself from a quiet neighbor into the continent's chief energy arbiter. When American delegates raised energy security issues at NATO meetings, Canadian representatives simply smiled gently. They knew that their resources had become a new weapon, bloodless, but no less destructive.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Meanwhile, mistrust was growing in Washington. Congress demanded reports on dependence on northern suppliers. Economists warned of the possibility of energy blackmail. In some closed-door meetings, scenarios were even discussed in which Canada would restrict uranium or oil exports in response to American tariffs. One Pentagon analysis document stated bluntly, "In the event of an energy crisis, Canada could inflict damage on our economy comparable to a full-scale cyber attack." Of course, some of these assessments were exaggerated. But the very fact that the phrase Canadian threat appeared in U.S. strategic plans spoke volumes. For the first time in decades, America felt that control over its northern border was no longer guaranteed.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
When Mark Carney made his remarks in London, few understood their significance. But now, months later, even the most skeptical politicians in Washington acknowledged that this was not an impulse, but a carefully calculated move. Canada did what no one expected it to do. It turned economic dependence into an instrument of power. And although it remains the same neighbor on the world map, its political weight has changed forever. America was used to looking north and seeing reliability. Now, when it looks that way, it sees not only a partner, but also an adversary that knows how to strike not with weapons, but with resources. And perhaps the most alarming thing for Washington is that this new type of conflict is being waged without gunfire, without armies, and without flags. Everything is decided by numbers, contracts, and energy. And in this game, Canada now has far more cards than the United States.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
When the story of the refusal to renew the license to export electricity to the US spread across the continent, many perceived it as a local episode. But behind the scenes, Ottawa was already acting according to a predetermined plan. What looked like a spontaneous reaction to American tariffs turned out to be part of a large-scale program, a strategy for energy independence and industrial transformation. In the offices of federal ministries, documents were being discussed in which the word export was gradually being replaced by the concept of national priority. Everything that had previously gone south from oil to rare earth metals was now seen as a lever capable of changing the balance of power, not only in North America, but also in the world. The main idea was that Canada would no longer sell resources without receiving political dividends in return. In early 2024, the government approved an internal memorandum that explicitly stated supplies of strategic resources must primarily benefit Canada economically, technologically, and diplomatically. This meant that the era of automatic supplies to the US was over. The same documents mentioned a term that sparked heated debate in Washington: resource sovereignty. In fact, it was about turning energy and natural resources into an instrument of political influence, which had previously been the prerogative of the great powers.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
The first steps were deliberate and cautious. New quotas were introduced in the provinces for oil and uranium exports, with priority given to domestic consumers. A new emphasis appeared in energy policy, support for domestic processing enterprises. Canada, which had been sending raw materials abroad for decades, began to build its own facilities for processing lithium, nickel, and copper. In some regions, full-cycle projects were launched, from extraction to the production of components for batteries and electric motors. Ottawa understood that the future of the global economy depends on energy storage technologies and intended to occupy a place in this chain, not as a supplier but as a producer. At the same time, the government launched the North Shift program, little known outside the country but key to the new course. Its essence was to create an infrastructure capable of redirecting energy flows not only to the south, but also to the east and west. This involved the construction of new port terminals on the Pacific Ocean, the modernization of railways to the Atlantic, and the connection of northern territories to a single power grid. One official report stated explicitly that these measures will allow Canada to develop its own export routes without dependence on American corridors. In essence, it was an energy revolution, quiet but profound.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Against the backdrop of these changes, processes were taking place in the world that played into Canada's hands. Europe, weakened after breaking ties with Russian energy resources, was desperately looking for stable suppliers. Asian economies needed nickel and cobalt for battery production. And it was at this moment that Ottawa offered itself as a new pillar of the global energy transition. The agreement signed with Indonesia was a breakthrough. It not only opened up access to a market of 270 million people, but also created a joint investment for the extraction and processing of nickel, a resource that was at the center of the struggle between the West and China. According to a leak from the Canadian Ministry of Industry, major European investors, including German companies that had previously worked with Russian and Chinese suppliers, also participated in this fund.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The work with Mexico was no less revealing. Formally, agriculture and migration were discussed, but in reality, the main item on the agenda was the creation of a joint infrastructure development fund. Canada allocated about $2 billion for these purposes, an amount that was almost unprecedented for Ottawa in terms of scale. The money was used to build ports and logistics corridors on Mexico's Pacific coast, giving Canadian companies direct access to Asian markets. This allowed Canada to bypass U.S. territory when transporting strategic resources. For Washington, this was a painful signal. Its northern neighbor was not just diversifying its exports, it was building an alternative geo-economic system.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
At the same time, a subtle diplomatic game was unfolding in Europe. After the onset of the energy crisis on the continent, Canada found itself in a unique position. It could offer not only oil and gas, but also clean energy technologies. Within a few months, Ottawa signed a series of agreements with Germany, France, and the Netherlands on the supply of hydrogen and processed critical minerals. European media wrote that Canada had become the new Norway, but with much greater ambitions. According to internal data from the European Commission, the share of Canadian companies in European renewable energy projects grew by 60% in just 6 months.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Washington watched this with growing concern. The US, accustomed to considering Canada part of its economic sphere, suddenly realized that it was acting completely independently. The White House began holding closed-door meetings to discuss options for exerting pressure, from revising trade agreements to introducing new tariffs. But these measures seemed powerless. Ottawa had prepared in advance. The share of exports to Asian and European markets had already grown so much that even a complete closure of the American market would not have been a disaster.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States. and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Meanwhile, an equally profound transformation was taking place within Canada itself. A society that had long lived with a sense of dependence on the US began to see itself as an independent force. At rallies in the provinces, slogans such as "Canadian resources should serve Canadians" were heard more and more often. Universities and research centers discussed the concept of a new Canadian way, a concept in which national wealth and technological innovation are combined into a single strategy. According to a sociological survey conducted in the spring of 2025, more than 70% of citizens supported the idea of restricting energy exports in favor of the domestic market. This was not a protest but a new consensus.